All right. Good morning. Happy Monday and a very happy Valentine's Day to anybody that's celebrating out there. We are really excited to kick off the series called Data is Love. My name is Aparna, and I'm really excited to welcome you today with my colleagues Nicole Decay and Phi Tai Nguyen. So, here's the thing that we are going to do. Every week, we're going to showcase experts across all industry, including data analytics, DEI, employee experience, technology, construction, and many more to uncover how a few simple questions can make data actionable. Think of this as your mini Monday bootcamp and come join us to learn about how to harness the data that has the power to transform your organization. Everyone is invited. And I just have to say this, you don't need any advanced Excel skills or Power BI or Tableau skills to join this conversation with us. So before I say anything else, I want to invite you to my phenomenal colleagues. First up, Nicole Decay.
Hi, I am Nicole. I wear a lot of different hats, including being a very new mom and a doctoral student right now who's also very close to graduating, and a chief science officer for a management consulting firm and a DE&I consulting business. In a previous life, I worked at a large aerospace company as an analyst and data scientist, and I launched the used aircraft parts program, which was valued at about $3 billion before I quit that role to pursue my PhD in people sciences. Now I'm focused on helping small to medium sized companies grow in the same innovative ways by building a safe and secure workplace for their employees. And that was why I left my career pretty much to join a new one. One of the things I'm passionate about is quantifying squishy topics. So my research is really highly influenced by my early career as a residential counselor in a lockdown facility for severely mentally ill children and teens. And then on top of that, a career in organizational science and corporate strategy. My research today is focused on the everyday traumas that and their prevalence in the workplace and its contribution to adverse experiences and home environments for children, as well as the negative outcomes that can plague organizations when people are regularly introduced to stressors in the workplace. I'm really interested in adverse work experiences, psychological well being, what helps people thrive at work, and how that impacts people's psychological distress and other symptoms that will get in the way of them being the best person that they can be. Most importantly, I'm also interested in workplaces that center employee voices and experience, and one that amplifies underrepresented groups like LGBTQIA, first gen and immigrants, veterans, people of color, and others with intersectional identities that don't tend to always make it into the mainstream research. And when I'm not working or parenting, I also run the largest free pantry in the city of Seattle in from my driveway. So enough about me. I'm going to pass on the mic to Fee.
Thank you. My name is Phi Tai Wing, and I was born in a refugee camp to parents who were escaping a war-torn country. And right from the start, like life as U.S. Immigrants, I was exposed to the realities of like low-income, first-gen, like survival, not knowing how we could thrive, but one day maybe that's the dream. And that serves as like the main motivator for me to go back to school and pursue my PhD. I really want, like Nicole mentioned, I want to amplify the voices of our most vulnerable laborers in our, who's like the backbone of our economy and society. I really want to make an impact in that like sort of space. And my journey up to this point has like been a short stint in Peace Corps Armenia for 2 years, then a little bit at a nonprofit in San Diego supporting first gen low income students, preparing them to go to college and providing support, involving their parents too. It's been great, but today, my research is focused on pay transparency and workplace equality and equity. And other things that I want to look at is how pay transparency could increase the job applicant pool. How could it promote accountability and transparency in organizations to their employees and shareholders. And in my free time, I love to cook a lot, eat that food, and then garden, read on some life hacks, and then travel.
Amazing. I love this. Okay, so for the people that are watching, I hope you're intrigued to learn a little bit more. So one of the things that we know and our team experiences on a daily basis is how powerful data stories can be and how the right kind of data can spark meaningful conversations that actually lead to action. After all, I think we use data to make so many decisions about our life. And we know that organizations use a lot of different kinds of data to make decisions about which products to develop, where they're going to sell them, or where in the world health interventions are needed and what those health interventions are going to be, right? And so when it comes to the health of the people inside of our organizations, data with context can really light the path forward.
Yeah, so for example, you really need to understand your data, and in the vein of Valentine's Day, you need to know them as well as an intimate friend or partner before you can really make a good decision on what you're going to do with the data. So when I was working in the used aircraft parts business, I was working with really bad data. The information had been mined and culled from these old bill of material sheets that were production sheets, PDFs in the 70s and 80s that were put into a database format so that people could use it. So if you didn't know the data well, if you hadn't talked to the people who were most intimate with it to find out its weaknesses, strengths, flaws, and the true character of the data, you would have made really bad assumptions. If you didn't ask those questions like Aparna mentioned, it could get you in a lot of trouble. So when I was in that role, one team of interns took that data at face value and went to our executive team to tell them that on a $3 million purchase, we could make $80 million. And this was because they used the data at face value. There was a flag that told you which parts could be, I'm going to put that in quotes, could be taken off the plane and refurbished for sale. That field was extremely inaccurate. And if you hadn't talked to the people who knew the data best, you wouldn't have known that if you didn't know what a part number meant, that those were nuts and bolts that were, $50 a piece, and there were tens of thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them on every airplane. It meant that they had tens of millions of dollars just in nuts and bolts that couldn't be resold in the used market. And so knowing your data intimately is very, very important. In the work we do now, something that we've seen in organizations in the past year is people having least favorable experiences. So meaning people who are least likely to feel supported it's not always people of color or women, depending on the organization. So if you only read the summary of HBR articles, you might assume that the biggest differences are based on race, ethnicity, or gender. And that's not always true. In one organization, it was a relatively young startup, really supportive of improving the organization. We saw actually some huge differences in tenure because at the startup, people who were early in their careers were not likely to feel a sense of belonging there because some of the people had been there for almost a decade, and they all had their in groups, and people who were new to the organization, which you wouldn't expect in a startup. You would expect, since most of it was made up of young people, and their tenure would be the least, that they would have a higher sense of belonging because they were with a lot of people who were similar to them. But that wasn't what we found. In another, we saw differences by income. And so it makes sense that people who make less than a living wage would be would be more impacted. But it's not information we tend to collect or analyze routinely. So that bit of data allowed this organization to adapt its policies regarding working from home, knowing that that was a key stressor for employees in the lower pay bands. That the key stressor in employees in the pay bands was the cost of the commute, because they were living in areas where they had to go far outside of the city to be able to afford rent. And so that was really interesting information that we only picked up because we dove deeply into the information that we collected.
Yeah, and I want to jump in with like another example that we've seen in the past year, of like an organization that shifted from like workplace equality to equity. And while that seems like those words are kind of used interchangeably, there is a subtle difference between those. And so we wanted to understand if the organization is like equitable in that, was it providing an experience that all people experience the same things, or like in ways that were fair, regardless of if the same policies were available. So, for example, like, can people who like recently became moms go maternity leave and then come back and still have the same opportunity for promotion as to like their male counterparts? Like, we see in like several different types of industries that like when men and women enter the workforce in equal numbers, like slowly over the years, women, whether it's like lack of opportunities through advancement, they men occupy more of those like higher leadership positions over time. And so it's really important for organizations to like look at what are their promotion data by gender, and to like set targets to achieve that like women can still get the support to grow despite having like life-changing circumstances like becoming a mom like Nicole. And so I think it's important to like collect those sorts of like intersectional data, and to see where that could lead the organization.
Okay, so we've given a couple of examples of how, we've used data to highlight what isn't working in organizations, right? And also how to shift from perhaps equality-based approaches to equity-based approaches. I can guarantee you that one of the things that you can expect each week from us and our guests is a little bit of real talk. We're not going to hide behind comfortable facts, and also not going to sugarcoat things, right? I believe that having a future of work that works for all of us is totally possible. It's totally something that we can accomplish. It just requires a little bit of work. So before we hop off today, let us know if you have any questions in the chat. Maybe tell us if there's a DEI challenge that you're working on or struggling with in your own organization, and we'll try to answer those now. But before we hop off, I want to know, like from Nicole, you and Fee, where do you go to learn yourself as like people that have you almost have PhDs, both of you, and you like are deep in this work. Where are you yourselves going to learn?
I can start. A lot of places. So I read an article that was published in the last 2 years that talked about DE&I being still in the infancy in terms of research. And so Fee and I are trained to go to peer-reviewed articles to see what the research says. But in this instance, there's not a lot of good data out there for us to use that as a data source. Plus, like, there's a lot of bias in those data sources because they're done a lot oftentimes with college students, or a lot of our management studies were done in the 90s and 2000s, so it's based on white men's opinions. And so there's a lot of missing information when it comes to trying to find out this information. So one place that I regularly go is other consulting firms. So what are other consulting firms doing? What have they found? So like the GDBI, the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarking. I think I said the acronym wrong, but they have a great report that benchmarks a lot of different organizations on what they're doing. There are a lot of people out in the field who want their information to be shared. So like Googling this information with file type PDF is like a way to get at that information. It's a little Google trick. So like file type one word with a colon, and you can get only certain types of files. And often that will give you like the research reports that people publish that can give you the latest and greatest in research that isn't going through the slow peer review process. Another place is our data. I mean, we're doing a lot of this work, and so I will look at correlations between what we're seeing and seeing what trends we can tease out and pull out. And, we're working on publishing that too, because we want other people to have access to this information so that we're not hiding it in the dark, because DE&I can't advance in the dark. Apprentice says that all the time.
Yeah, so this is okay, so this is really interesting because we've never had a conversation about this, right? Like a lot of the reports that other consulting firms are putting out, they are relevant because they're happening in the now, right? And I think that the instinct is often to look at like HBR articles, which are often opinions, right? They're not actually looking at like real data, or to look at Forbes and some of these other places. But instead, like we can look at actual real time research that's happening in companies. Fee, I'm curious, like where do you lean into?
I love to read the news in the morning. So it might be a little clickbaity, but I like to read the headlines of giant, I'm not going to name the company or the store, but like the giant grocery store employees are going to food banks to feed themselves because they're not making a living wage to afford food, even though they are feeding other families. Like that's where I lean into and try to understand, like, why is this happening? Like, what are the policies happening in this company to make the situation where this is becoming a reality, in the juxtaposition between that. And I actually like to see a state where, in the ideal world, like what do we want to see? So a lot of the other Nordic, Scandinavian countries, they tend to have a more progressive like workplace practices where we could sort of use it as a case study to understand like what has worked for them given their policies and structures that might be different from what it is here, but like to strive to close that gap between where we are here and versus where they are. I like to kind of play thought experiments in that way, and like collecting data too, obviously.
Oh, I love that. And like the idea that we talked about earlier, just briefly, the context piece of it, right? Like looking at the news can offer some real-time context. So like, let's say we are working with a large grocery chain whose name we won't name, and we see certain kind of responses from employees. We know that like there's a struggle there that doesn't show up on like your typical kind of HR surveys. All right, so the news, consulting. As we move through the series, we'll also have other sort of helpful places to round out our knowledge and awareness, not only around DE&I, but looking at DE&I more expansively, as sort of human rights and like the rights of employees inside organizations. So I hope that you'll join us next week. We're going to announce the guest in a couple of days. So stay tuned for that. And Fee and Nicole, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm excited to do this with you again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.